Welcome to the Real Paranormal Stories podcast with your host, Christopher Buckner. Send your stories to realparanormalstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Royalty-free music provided by Kevin MacLeod and Tabletop Audio. And now, let's take a trip into the paranormal. This story comes from Reddit user HikeRobCT. And this is their story. My wife and I moved into our old house in New England in summer 2000. We had looked at dozens of houses, but this one just immediately felt like home. Soon after, we invited our good friend James and his husband up for a weekend. Keep James and his husband in mind. We were pretty well into getting our late night party on, playing cards, drinking, smoking in the dining room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw, though the experience was more like perceived, very vividly, an older woman with jet black hair sitting next to the old upright piano in the corner. The piano came with the house. We specifically requested that the previous owner include it in the sale because it was so cool, and we didn't have much furniture. It wasn't even slightly scary. In fact, it was just like she was hanging out. I mentioned it to everyone and we laughed it off. Drinking and fun continued through the night. I was never really a ghost believer, and I'm still a skeptic 100%. But the rest of this story makes me really wonder. Several weeks later, we met a neighbor from down the street who lived in the neighborhood for 45 years. "You live in the Muriel King house?" she tells us. Muriel was a really interesting lady. She was a famous fashion designer in the 1930s. Please Google her. That lived there alone after her husband committed suicide. Very tragic, but she was an interesting lady. Very independent and ahead of her time. She traveled all over the world. She was Greek, I think. Greek? I ask. Weird question, but did she have black hair? Yes, she had jet black hair even when she was an old woman. It was very striking. Yep, I got the chills right then. Many weeks later, I met another neighbor from down the street that had lived there for 60 plus years. And he starts telling me about Muriel. She was a famous fashion designer. She designed gowns for Rita Hayworth and all the classic film stars. And she designed costumes for Broadway plays, too. Her parties were legendary, he tells me. She used to have all her gay boyfriends from Broadway come up on the train, and they'd drink and sing show tunes at the piano in the dining room all night long. Yep, now this all could be coincidental, but it just seems too much so. But she must have been an awesome woman. People from around town have given us some of her original drawings, and even an unfinished dress she was working on. There haven't been any more Muriel sightings, but shortly after my wife got pregnant, 20 years ago, we both woke up out of a cold sleep at the same time and looked at each other like, what the fuck? And then our bedroom door slammed hard. We like to think that Muriel wasn't a fan of kids. She never had any of her own. So she was like, "Later, y'all, I'm out of here." That's my story. This story comes from Reddit user Leia Renee, spelled Layarenee. And this is their story. This happened about a year and a half ago, and I will never forget it. Basically, Mom and I moved into our new trailer a few years ago and knew that it was haunted within a couple months. Our stuff would disappear and then reappear right next to us, and doors would open and slowly close on their own. But all that stopped after a couple months unless friends visit. When friends visit, the ghosts like to try to scare them. Despite knowing our house is haunted, we had no problems since the ghosts never harmed us in any way. Until the day this happened. I was about 18 or 19. At the time, one of my friends and I were scraping wallpaper off my bedroom wall to paint it. Then my bedroom door, which was previously shut tight, suddenly swung open. My friend jumped up while I laughed and explained to her that ghosts in my house do that sometimes when I have friends over, but they never do any harm. She calmed down, but the door slowly started shutting and then suddenly opened again and again. So I told my friend that maybe it's time we took a break and got some food. While we were in the kitchen, I was looking through the cupboards when my friend, who still had the wallpaper scraper in her hand, said that if a ghost tried to attack her, she'd cut them. I told her not to threaten them because they've never harmed anyone, so there's no reason to threaten them for no reason. Then I stood at my kitchen sink to wash a dish when suddenly it felt like my arm was burning. I looked down and saw several deep scratch marks on my arm. They looked like they spelled a word, but I couldn't tell what. Still have no idea what was trying to be spelled. I immediately put my arm under cold water to try to cool it down and called my friend over to look, so my friend put down the wallpaper scraper. Then I sat on the couch and showed my friend and told her that's the reason why you never threaten ghosts. And it turned out that while I was showing her my arm at the sink, the scraper disappeared. My arm felt like it was on fire for so long that I had to wrap it up in tight bandages in order for it to stop hurting. And that is their story. That's all for this episode of the Real Paranormal Stories podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review anywhere this podcast can be found.